3.5 weeks since this little puppy was implanted. I can lead with my right. Not perfectly by any means, but you kind of find ways to do things different from what you've done them before. So I'm sitting as opposed to wandering. Keeps my heart rate down. I'm not flailing. That's why this left hand is in a sling, so I'm not flailing my arms as pastors and preachers are inclined to do. And I've never been a patient. Really, I've never been a patient. Last time I was in the hospital, I've been in the hospital twice. When I was born, and about 40 years ago, I had all my wisdom teeth taken out in one shot, so I went in the hospital for one overnight. And when I came out, it was as if they hadn't even done it. I felt so good. I had actually had somebody coming in to preach for me, and I was really ripped because it's like I could have preached if I only had known. So my hospital experience is really limited. This was a very interesting experience that, on July the 2nd, was that 4 Sundays ago, July the 2nd, I was here with you folks worshiping. Pastor Barry was preaching on Jonah chapter 4, and I had already had the sermon ready for the next Sunday to fill in for Pastor Barry as he was going to be away. And so I was here that Sunday morning and worshiped with you. July the 3rd, the Monday, our grandsons land at our place about 8 o'clock after driving from Prince Albert. Their dad was coming down to teach a gun course at Depot for the RCMP, and they dropped the boys off with us, and they got out of the car, and I said, hey guys, let's go over to the park. You've been in the van for 4 hours. Let's go stretch our legs. So we get a soccer ball, we get a basketball, and we head over to the park. We're just at the corner of Sherwood and Discovery, where the West Hill Baptist Church is. There's a park behind West Hill Baptist Church, and so the boys have been there numerous times with me. Let's go to the park, stretch our legs. So we head over to the park, and I kind of remember crossing the road and getting to the other side, beside the Baptist Church. And the rest is foggy for about the next 15 or 20 minutes. I remember being in the park, and I remember running for the ball. I'm on this side of the ball. Hayden, the 9-year-old, is on this side of the ball. And then everything blanked out. And apparently I face planted. And the 11-year-old said, yeah, you laid there for a while, Papa, but then you said, let's go shoot some baskets. So I took the 2 boys and the basketball. We went over to shoot some baskets at the little basketball set up there. And we were there for a little bit. And the 11-year-old said, Papa, you were talking funny. Let's go back and see Grandma. And so eventually I caved, and the 11-year-old ran to get Grandma. The 9-year-old's walking me back through the park, across the street. I don't remember any of that. All I remember is being next time in the driveway. And Sharon's asking me what day it is, and I don't know what day it is. She's asking me what her name is. I did know what her name was. But so these memory gaps, and I didn't remember shooting hoops, and I remembered my nose being very sore from the face plant in the park, but I didn't remember much else. So Sharon, because I wouldn't go in the house, she was saying, come on in the house. Come on. Wouldn't go in the house. She calls a friend who's a nurse, who has a husband who's a doctor, and they both say, yeah, you should probably get him to emerge with this memory loss, and, his nose, could be a concussion from hitting the ground. So I said, okay, let's go to emerge. So we went to emerge to the Pasqua. And what we discovered, what we heard after I was at the Pasqua for a while, they did some blood work, they did ECGs and stuff, and by about 3 in the morning, the word was, it's nothing to do with your head. It's all about your heart. And low heart rate and bottomed out. I can't do air quotes, but they used the word pause. My heart paused, 8 seconds one time, 7 seconds another time, so here I am with a pacemaker. Now, the reason I mentioned July the 2nd, because Pastor Barry left us with a a challenge. I don't know if you remember that. Pastor Barry was preaching on Jonah chapter 4. That's the place where Jonah gets really angry. First, he's really angry with God. Jonah chapter 4 starts out Jonah saying to God, I knew you'd do that. The Ninevites responded to the call to repentance, and God withheld his judgment on them. And Jonah says, I knew you'd do that. And then Jonah's angry because his shade was taken away from him. We've had a few days where we'd really like to have our shade, wouldn't we? So we kind of know what that's like for Jonah. But Jonah is really angry, and Pastor Barry left us with a challenge because there's a question there in Jonah chapter 4 where God says to Jonah, shouldn't I have mercy? Shouldn't I have compassion on the people of Nineveh? Well, not as far as Jonah was concerned. There's no room for that. They were just his enemies. He would consider them God's enemies. They were the enemies of the people of Israel. And Barry left us with a challenge that said, be imitators of God instead of being imitators of Jonah. Well, that's a pretty hefty challenge, being an imitator of God. When Alejandro read the call to worship this morning, I mean, the challenge is even more hefty, right? Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And in fact, I asked Pastor Barry, because I told him where I was going this Sunday, and I told him I wanted to follow up his challenge to us from July the 2nd. I said, you pick the call to worship. So I think I can see how it fits. I hope you can see how it fits in this whole process of not being like Jonah, but being like God. So how did the challenge go for you? What happened when you came across an enemy or someone who is maybe not friendly towards you or someone who is maybe even against you? You came across someone who believes different than you believe, someone who has different cultural background than you have. How has it been being like God as opposed to being like Jonah? How easy is it or not easy is it to show compassion for our enemies? How easy is it to listen to those who we're absolutely sure are wrong? Dead wrong. Because that's what the challenge is. Am I going to be like Jonah or am I going to be like God? And then there's those who we think are wrong and we'd like to change their thinking. It's interesting, rereading Jonah chapter 4, and you might, I don't know how you feel about environmentalists and conservationists, but if you have a particular opinion about animal lovers, I suggest you read Jonah chapter 4, verse 11 again. And before you respond, figure out what the animals have to do with the repentance that came to Nineveh. Okay? And that's the challenge that Pastor Barry gave us. Like, be imitators of God. Don't be imitators of Jonah. And the reason I kind of focus on that, because there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger in the world and in the church. There's a lot of angry people. Jonah was very angry. He was angry at God. He was angry at the Ninevites. He was angry at the worm that ate his tree. Remember what James says. If you're inclined to be an angry person at the world or the people around you, remember what James says. The anger of man, the anger of a person does not accomplish the righteousness of God. So, I leave that with you. But I have this reminder. You ever notice on pill bottles? Take this medication for the prescribed duration. How are you doing what you're told? How am I doing what I'm told, right? This is week 4 of 6 weeks of rest and no raising my arm above my shoulders and a few other things that I'm supposed to do. How are you and I at doing what we're told, right? Again, Jonah, right? How good was Jonah at doing what he was told? There's something in us that just says, nobody is going to tell me what to do. And then when it comes to medication and doctor's orders, I feel pretty good today. I think I could have done it without a sling. I think I could have done it without a stool. But because my wife's here, I'm not. Do you know anybody who gives up on their medication because they feel good? Feeling better? I don't need the meds. It's just something in us, right? Like, don't you tell me what to do. And so that's our anger at the federal government, the provincial government, the health authorities, the regional government, the civic government. I mean, we're angry at everybody because we don't like being told what to do. Those pills are a good reminder to me that obedience and submission for a follower of Jesus are not a bad thing. So today we continue, as it says on the front of your bulletin, we continue the summer series, Why the Old Testament Matters. And I'm not only the Old Testament, I am sold on the relevance of the Bible in total. Like, I am sold on how the Bible connects, like Jonah and anger. Jonah and anger, if you watch not only anger in protests, but anger in Christian protests, right? And there's all kinds of relevance to me, and the Bible speaks to that kind of stuff. I'm sold on the relevance of the Bible, but we're talking about the Old Testament because Pastor Barry and I, as we were talking, the Old Testament has fallen on hard times. For a lot of reasons, the Old Testament isn't significant anymore. One of those reasons is just the way we label it. We call it old. Who wants to learn something that's old? And then Jonah is a minor prophet, right? I want to hear the major prophets. I don't want to go watch the minor league team. I want to watch the major league team. So even the labels, and please realize Old Testament, minor, major prophets, none of those are inspired labels or titles. They're just titles and headings we've given to them, but they do, and they can, not for everybody, but they can be a turnoff. And so sometimes I call it the Hebrew Scriptures instead of the Old Testament. And the Hebrew Scriptures have their own X-files. The X-files in the Hebrew Scriptures are the Exodus, the exile, and the expectations that came from those two significant events. The Exodus is the forced migration. I don't know if you ever think of Exodus and what happened in the Exodus as a forced migration, which is what's happening in many parts of the world these days. The situation in Sudan and the forced migration. The invasion of Ukraine and the forced migration. The Exodus is a forced migration of the children of God from Egypt to the land that God had promised them. Exodus is about a forced migration and wandering, as we sang, in the desert. And so next Sunday, when we celebrate communion, it's all going back to the Exodus, the Passover. The exile, years later, has two phases. The exile has two phases. The first phase is Assyria, a.k.a. Nineveh. We were just talking about Nineveh. Pastor Barry was just talking about Nineveh. Jonah was sent to Nineveh. The Assyrians, who were known as annihilators, come in and just sweep through the northern part of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, and just wipe it out and decimate it. Then around 587 BC, the Babylonians are the new empire on the block, and the Babylonians come, and they invade not only the northern kingdoms that the Assyrians, the Ninevites, had invaded, but they're going to take over Jerusalem. Now, the Babylonians aren't annihilators. They are to a certain degree, but they're also human traffickers. The Babylonians like to use the people they capture. Sometimes we call that slavery. In church circles, we call that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're taken captive back to Babylon. They're trafficked and put in a place where they benefit the empire of Babylon. But ultimately, with the Babylonians, it's the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, I want you to think for a minute. Pictures you've seen, images you've seen of ultimate destruction. It might be something from World War II. It might be something from the recent invasion of Ukraine. It might be a picture of a tsunami, maybe Fukushima or Phuket. It might be a monsoon, a super monsoon Haiyan that wiped out Tacloban, and maybe you remember the pictures from Tacloban. Even the latest super typhoon, Doksuri, went through northern Philippines and is now heading across to China. Think of any of those pictures, whether it's flood or fire. What was it? Barely 2 years ago, Lytton, BC was wiped out by fire, and you'd see those overhead shots of before and after. That's a good idea of what happened to Jerusalem when the Babylonians came in. They just wiped out everything. Flood, fire, tornado. Think destruction. Think devastation. Think trauma. What pictures come to mind when you hear me sort of giving you some of those images? Any pictures come to mind that I missed or that I've forgotten about? Trauma, destruction, devastation. You do watch the news, don't you? Earthquakes, tsunamis, for sure. Have that picture in your mind as we're about to read from the book of Lamentations. We're going to read selective passages, and we're doing the first half of Lamentations this week, not the whole book, just selected verses, and the next week we'll do some from the second half of the book of Lamentations. But, well, there's another one we forgot. There's one I forgot. COVID. The most significant global event in the last 80 years. Now, are any of you over 85 here? Then you're off the hook, right? I think. Then World War II is probably your biggest significant global event. COVID is the biggest significant global event in the last 80 years. And I'm very grateful to the medical staff at the Pasco Emerge and the cardiac surveillance unit for their care, because I had in my mind all that the medical staff and the medical caregivers have been through in the last 3 years, and it's not over yet. But COVID would be another picture, right? So we're going to read. I invite you, if you are able, to stand with me. The words will be on the screen, and I'm going to read selected verses from Lamentations chapters 1, 2, and 3. So please stand with me if you are able. Jerusalem, once so full of people, is now deserted. She who once was great among the nations now sits alone like a widow. Once the queen of all the earth, she is now a slave. She sobs through the night. Tears stream down her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one left to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her and become her enemies. Judah has been led away into captivity, oppressed with cruel slavery. She lives among foreign nations and has no place of rest. Her enemies have chased her down. We sang about God's goodness running after us. Sometimes that's not the only thing running after us. Her enemies have chased her down, and she has nowhere to turn. The roads to Jerusalem are in mourning. Not just the people, the roads. The roads to Jerusalem are in mourning, for crowds no longer come to celebrate the festivals. The roads were missing the people of God coming to the temple to celebrate the feasts. The city gates are silent. Her priests groan and groan becomes a very common word here. Her young women are crying, how bitter is her fate. The enemy has plundered her completely, taking every precious thing she owns. She has seen foreigners violate her sacred temple, the place the Lord had forbidden them to enter. The Lord, in his anger, has cast a dark shadow over beautiful Jerusalem. The fairest of Israel's city lies in the dust, thrown down from the heights of heaven. In his day, God's day of great anger, the Lord has shown no mercy even to his temple. And if you know your Old Testament, and you know what we sang this morning, his mercy lasts for a lifetime. His anger is but for a moment. But this is the moment for the people of Jerusalem. Without mercy, the Lord has destroyed every home in Israel. In his anger, he has broken down the fortress walls of beautiful Jerusalem. He has brought them to the ground, dishonoring the kingdom and its rulers. All the strength of Israel vanishes beneath his fierce anger. The Lord has withdrawn his protection as the enemy attacks. He consumes the whole land of Israel like a raging fire. How many fires have we got going in Canada today? And I'm not making that connection that the fires are from God. Just understand what the devastation in Jerusalem is like. He has made me chew on gravel. Think about that while you're having your nice lunch here today. He has rolled me in the dust. Peace has been stripped away, and I have forgotten what prosperity is. I cry out, my splendor is gone. Everything I had hoped for from the Lord is lost. The thought of my suffering and homelessness is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss. May the hearing of God's word bring light to our path. Thank you. You may be seated. Well, Lamentations is not a very popular book. Now, I heard Pastor John, when Pastor John preached for me on July the 9th, when I was supposed to preach, I heard he preached on Lamentations. I haven't listened to his sermon. I'm going to listen to it after I've finished my 2 sermons. But I'm going to leave you with a challenge. It's not what Pastor John says. It's not what Larry says. Acts chapter 17, the followers of Jesus in the little community of Berea were more noble because they searched the scriptures to see if these things were so. So my challenge to you is, you've heard what Pastor John said. You'll hear today what I say. My challenge is for you not to agree because Pastor John says, or not to agree with me because I said something, and not to disagree with me because I said something. For you to search the scriptures to see if the things we're saying are so. But Lamentations, it's not a popular, it's poetry. It's poetry. If it wasn't popular just by the name, the fact that it's poetry might be even less popular for it. Maybe like poetry. Don't answer. The QC insert this week in the flyers. Poetry as a teaching tool. How many of you were drawn to read that article because it was about poetry? Don't answer. My guess is not too many. I don't think poetry is something that draws us. Lamentations is poetry. But not only that, it's gloom. It's gloom and despair. You heard what we just read, and you go, wow. You might even go, I didn't come to church to hear that kind. I can watch the news to hear that kind of stuff. Pastor Barry and I have preached before on the Psalms and the Psalms of Lament. I believe we did Psalm 42, 43, and 44. Pastor Barry did 42, I did 43, and he came back with 44. And those are lament psalms, crying out to God. Sorrow and grief, hardship, agony, questions. How long? How long, O Lord, Why, O Lord? And Lamentations, you throw it in the midst, it's asking, where are you? Why are you silent, God? Where are you? Did you know that the lament psalms, of 150 psalms in the songbook of the Hebrew people, 150 psalms, somewhere between 40 and 50% is lament. 40 and 50% is lament. That would be like Warren picking 2 to 3 songs every Sunday that are gloom, despair, funeral dirges. Yeah, I know, my hand was flailing, I know. Old habits are hard to break, aren't they? Imagine Warren picking 2 or 3 songs every week that are more funeral, like Lamentations is a funeral dirge. Lament psalms sound like something from a funeral. Grief, trauma, sorrow, complaint, disappointment, frustration, protest. Now you might say, well, Pastor John preached on it July the 2nd, you're preaching on it July 30th, you're preaching on it next week. That's 3 out of the last 5 Sundays. 3 Sundays out of 52 is what percent? 3 Sundays out of 52 in a year is what? 6%? 7%? Right? Why? We have this, I mean, we, in our society in general, right? And as a church, we kind of absorb these things from our society. We have an aversion to death. We have an aversion to bad news. Even though bad news usually precedes good news, we have this aversion to it. And so we have this aversion to lament. And now there is lament in the New Testament. Jesus is known as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. That's his profile. That's Jesus' profile. A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Not just because he died on the cross. That's his profile. That's his identity as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He weeps over Jerusalem. He cries out on the cross, my God, Psalm 22, one of the strongest laments in the book of Psalms. Why have you forsaken me? He screams from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Paul. 2 Corinthians 1, Paul says he despaired even of life. That's pretty serious stuff. That's almost as low as, humanly speaking, I think we can go, right? He despaired even of life. Romans 7, the good that I want to do, I don't do. That might not be as serious as despairing even of life, but I think all of us who are followers of Jesus wrestle with that. The good I want to do, I don't do. That's a lament, Romans 7. We like the end of Romans 7, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory. We don't know what to do with that. The good that I want to do, I don't do. That's where lament comes in. Romans chapter 8 talks about groaning. Talks about creation groaning. Talks about creation groaning until we, followers of Jesus, experience our full redemption. Creation groans. Then we groan because we don't know how to pray. That's lament. Then Paul quotes a verse from the Old Testament about how we die every day for the sake of our Savior. And then he gets to we are more than conquerors, which we sang this morning. We like the end result. I like the end result. I don't like the process. I like the fact that when this pacemaker is done and these 6 weeks are over, I can do the things I did before. I can run. I can throw a baseball. I like that ending. I don't like the process. I'm not very patient with the process. I want to get out of the process. It's awkward. It's annoying. It's humiliating. I don't like the process. I like the ending. Jonah chapter 4 is very emotional. Pastor Barry got kind of emotional when he was preaching on Jonah chapter 4. Then Pastor Barry was preaching on Psalm 63. Again, a very emotional psalm. And Pastor Barry got kind of emotional. I think Pastor Barry is sometimes too hard on himself. And I've told him that. I said, Barry, you're not the only one who goes through those things. And it sounds like sometimes as you're talking about your own struggles, I think you're too hard on yourself. But he's really emotional with those things. And it's been a very emotional last couple of weeks as he's preached on Jonah and preached on Psalm 63. Emotions play a significant role, and lament has a lot to do with emotions. The verses we read in Lamentations have a lot to do with emotions. Even the emotions of inanimate objects like the roads to Jerusalem. Emotions play a significant role in the Hebrew Scriptures. Emotions play a significant role in the Old Testament. What happens in Lamentations as we read the experience of different voices after the Babylonians had decimated the capital city, the city of God, the temple of God, the place where God resided, broken down the walls, and taken away the young, the healthy, the wise, the useful. It's filled with emotion, gut-wrenching, heartbreaking, tear-jerking emotion, but not deal-breaking emotion. So as they cry out to God, as they protest to God this situation, as they ask why, how long, where in the world are you, it's tear-jerking, it's gut-wrenching, it's heartbreaking, but it's not a deal-breaker because they have this relationship with God. It's a covenant relationship with God, which is kind of like a contract, but more than a contract. It's a relationship. It's a two-way relationship. It's a relationship. It's a contract. It's a bond. It's a connection. God came and said, I will be your God and you will be my people. Here are your privileges. Here's what participation looks like. I will be your God and you will be my people. We will have this relationship, and here's your responsibility. Here's my responsibility. I will be the God you know me to be, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, not never angry, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness, but I will not leave the guilty unpunished. Jonah chapter 4, Exodus 34. Relationship and responsibility on God's part and on his people's part. And, you and I identify with the people of God in the Old Testament, right? Barry's quoted the verse from Romans chapter 15. These things happened to them as examples so that we might find encouragement and hope. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, a couple times, we'll look at this next week, says, these things happened as examples that we might not crave evil things. So there's a sense in which, next time you're driving by Toys R Us on Albert Street, realize that the Old Testament, you could say, they are us. They are us. And that's the mirror of us. The people of God then, people of God now. The people of God then had relationship and responsibility. You and I, as followers of Jesus, we have relationship and we have responsibility. So what happens? And I encourage you to read the book of Lamentations between now and next week. You might say, I don't want to read that stuff. That's depressing. I don't blame you. I understand that. It's heartbreaking. It's gut-wrenching. But it's not a deal breaker. And there's something we can learn as to how the people of God are called to let God know how they feel. Let God know what your questions are. Let God know what's stirring it. And he already does. So let him know. Express it. Verbalize it. Why is this lament thing such a hard pill to swallow? Why is this lament thing such a hard pill to swallow? We just don't like it. I've sat in church and we sing old hymns. I love Warren picked Worship the King. That's a great old hymn. It's a good hymn. It's just a good hymn. The nice thing is it's not typical funeral hymn. Because I've sat in church and heard old hymns like the Old Rugged Cross, and I go, oh man, that's like a funeral hymn. Because that's the only place you hear it these days. But why is this lament, this recognition of things that are sorrowful and sad. It's such a hard pill to swallow. Well, I think we've taken some bad habits. I think we've sort of followed the way of our culture, you know. We don't have funerals anymore. We have celebrations of life. Let's turn this on its head and make it positive as opposed to negative. I think the biblical perspective would be Ecclesiastes chapter 7. It's better to go to a funeral than to a party. Or, as you might see it in your translation, better go to a funeral than a house of feasting. And our culture, our society has an aversion to death. And so we turn funerals into celebrations of life because we want to put a positive spin on it. Follower of Jesus or not. Came across a quote by a theologian from Aberdeen, University of Aberdeen in the United Kingdom. John Swinton is his name. He says this: worship that constantly emphasizes happiness and joy can be profoundly difficult for people who just don't experience that. Worship that constantly emphasizes happiness and joy can be profoundly difficult for people who just don't experience that. If you have enduring depression and all your church ever talks about is happiness and how you should be happy, and even some of our good old hymns, what a friend we have in Jesus, you should never be discouraged. Really? Really? Why? Because the hymn writer says so? I'm sorry, I'm discouraged quite often. And especially in these 6 weeks, there's lots of discouragement there that I can find. And Pastor Barry had open heart surgery. I had 7 staples. He had 135 staples or something like that. Lots of discouragement. And many of you, I suspect all of you, I mean, you laughed when I said I'd only been in the hospital once since I was born, and that was for one night. You snickered because, poor boy, if you only knew. Well, I know. I got a pretty good idea now. If you have enduring depression and all your church ever talks about is happiness and how you should be happy, then you're going to find yourself either faking your spirituality or simply feeling miserable. I went to the hospital thinking it was my head, right? I thought I'd hit the ground, I'd face planted. Found out it was my heart. Found out later, people who know better, people who know later, but people who knew at the hospital said, no, it's not your head, it's your heart. People who knew said, no, Larry, it's your heart. Okay, can't argue with that. Later on, I found out from a retired nurse, when I was telling her the story, she said, yeah, if you hit the ground with your knees and your nose and your arms don't move, it's your heart. That's a surefire, that's your heart. I didn't know that. She knew that. So when people that know tell me, Larry, it's your heart, I've got to accept that. The doctor Sharon called wisely. Yeah, get him to emerge. Even though at that time we thought that there was concussion. It was my head. But you know, there's a 3H club in the church. And I close with this. There's a 3H club in the church. Head, heart, and hands. We need all three. And you and I, individually as followers of Jesus, need to have all three functional. Our head, our heart, and our hands. But you know, I wonder if we're so much in our head space that maybe it's more of a heart issue than a head issue. You know, we check our boxes on belief and doctrine and what's right and what's wrong. That's a head thing. That's not a heart thing. What Pastor Barry challenged us to do July the 2nd after Jonah 4 was a heart thing. It was a heart thing. I kind of think Jonah had heart issues, but he didn't know it. I think Jonah had heart issues in the belly of the fish. And I think he just kind of verbalized those things he had learned as a child and memorized as a child, and he just verbalizes them because they're the right things to say, and he gets thrown up on the shore, and he goes to Nineveh, and he's still angry, and he's still mad. I'm just guessing, but I think he was just saying those words. They were just words. He was faking it. But he did what God told him. Nation of Israel. Lamentations tells them it's a heart issue. They were sure they were doing the right thing. They were absolutely sure they were right in the things that they were doing, and they were dead wrong. What about us? Head, hand, heart, and then that engages our hands. One of the songs Warren had us sing this morning closed with the phrase, "The seed I received, I will sow." That's a head, heart, hands thing, right? Comes in, goes out. Comes in, goes out. Why did the children of Israel go into exile? Because it was a heart issue. I'm going to invite Warren and the team to come back. We're going to sing a closing song. Warren had selected it, and I think it's a good way to finish. It just kind of reminds us, like I'm kind of ending on a question here, like heads, hands, and heart, what is it? What is it? I think it's our heart. I think it's our heart. And when our heart engages, our hands will connect, and our hands will, as the song said, the seed we receive, we will sow. I have a few closing comments after we sing this song, but allow this song to kind of go back to the words that we read in Lamentations and what you've heard this morning. And maybe you came thinking it was your head. I hope we all leave realizing it's our heart.